everyone's favorite butterfly shaped organ. Let's move on to the thyroid. Okay. So the other thing that I see, I'm hopefully at this point, if you listen to the first lecture and you're listening now, there is, if you are engaging in too much fasting, too often, and too aggressive, it is this hormone, endocrine organ, I should say, that is going to be affected. And most often what I see is for women who are aggressively fasting, what we tend to see when we're kind of looking at thyroid panels, like if we're looking at blood work, is an increase in something called reverse T3. Now, reverse T3 is basically, I like to tell my patients, it's kind of like junk T3. It's sort of like kind of the mirror opposite of the active hormone T3, but it doesn't really do much. It is a feedback loop. It is a feedback mechanism. And when you're aggressively fasting, when you are suppressing your insulin levels for too long, this can contribute to an increase in reverse T3, which of course is going to contribute to suppression of thyroid function. One of the things that is kind of classic, or a side effect, let's say, or a clinical indicator of an elevated reverse T3 is a decrease in body temperature and always feeling cold. Like if you're always cold, like you're cold in the summer, let's say, or you always are wearing like sweaters and all of that, your reverse T3 might be elevated. So we want to be thinking about how we can support the thyroid. I believe I've done other podcasts. I know I've done other podcasts on the thyroid. So we'll make sure that we link them in the show notes for you to have a look at. But one of the things I like to always make sure that I am myself consuming, as well as my patients, are high selenium and high iodine foods like salt. Salt is very important. So for me, like I'm Portuguese, so, I love me some sardines. So sardines, one of my favorite ways to get high selenium foods. Brazil nuts, the heavyweight champion, we'll say, of high selenium foods. And of course, if you can stomach liver, that's also great as well. I cannot do that. I will be very open and honest with you. So I do have the capsules, like the liver capsules, or I really like liverwurst. I have found that liverwurst and me are very good friends. So I like liverwurst, which is basically kind of like a liver pate with, sometimes there's heart and like other spices and stuff in it as well. Now, some people have a high reverse T3 even when they're not calorically restricted. Okay. So that implies that the thyroid issue may have more to do with the suppression of insulin itself than it does with the restriction of calories. And of course, as it usually goes, this is way more common in women than it is in men. I would say that if you, at least the patient population that I have seen, this is happening in at least like, call it 30 to 40% of women, where we are seeing aggressive fat, like the suppression of insulin, let's say, or if the other population, like they've been doing keto for too long. You've been doing the ketogenic diet for like years and years and years. And we see this like chronic suppression of insulin, which leads to this elevated levels of reverse T3. It's like, I call this like the deadly triad. I talk about this with my doctors in Estima certification. It's kind of like this deadly triad of a woman who is aggressively fasting. She's doing way too much cardio. Like she's at Orange Theory and she has her Peloton bike and she has all the things. And she's doing keto, let's say, or some form of caloric restriction. And she's doing, in her attempt either to lose weight or, to look a certain way. It's kind of this like orthorexic type of behavior that leads this sort of cluster of these sort of three things, like over cardioing, over fasting, and then overly calorically restricting, is often where we start to see suppression of thyroid function. And the other classic for me often as well is a woman who's like, let's say she's doing Peloton or whatever it is, Orange Theory. And I'm not trying to throw shade at these particular companies. It's just that those are the two that I hear the most. So I'm using them as examples. Certainly there are other apps and there are other programs where people are doing, high intensity interval training far too often. Okay. So this kind of gets into a conversation of like, when we are doing our cardiovascular work, which is important, what zone should we be training in? Most women are, working way too hard. They're doing it 4 or 5 times a week. They're probably in zone 5 or 6, and they're in zone 5 or 6 for like 40 minutes to 60 minutes, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times a week, which of course is going to drive up that cortisol. We were just talking about cortisol before. This is kind of paired in with it as well. If you're driving up, that is an adaptation that your body's like, why are we running from a tiger 6 times a week? Why is this output necessary? I'm much more a fan, and I've spoken about this before in an episode that I believe is entitled Chronic Cardio, which we'll also link in the show notes for you. But zone 2 and zone 3 is kind of where I like to keep. And I would say preferentially, if I had to pick between those two, zone 2 is where I preferentially like to train. If I'm doing any cardiovascular work, it's going to be in zone 2. When I'm lifting, I'm certainly in zone 2 as well, because that's kind of where life happens. Life happens in zone 1 and zone 2, right? We walk, we stand, we run, we rush to get, we kind of trot, let's say, to catch the bus, or, to get in line, or to walk faster, like to pass someone on the sidewalk, life happens in zone 2. And I feel like if we're training, hopefully you're training to look better, to change your body composition, to change your metabolic and your physiological health, but you're also training to get better at life, right? Like you're also training so that you don't have to ask somebody to help you lift something or open a jar or get up off the floor. You can get up off the floor unassisted, right? Like hopefully the training in your exercise program is to help you be better at life right now. And also, again, taking that longer lens, for you to be better at life when you're 20 or 30 years from now, right? Because that's going to happen. We're going to be 20 or 30 years older. And, we might as well start training for that now. So fasting aggressively, not a huge fan for the thyroid. So again, one of the ways that I will typically counsel someone if they do have if they do have low functioning thyroid, is to easy does it and slowly does it, right? So we don't want to change all the things all at once. The thyroid is usually the last organ, at least I've observed this, like it's sort of the last thing to go. So it's not like your thyroid wakes up and it's like, I cannot handle these conditions, I'm gone. Like on day one, like it takes a couple of decades for the thyroid to be like, listen, like we got to talk, because this environment is not acceptable anymore. So with a woman with Hashimoto's, there's or low functioning thyroid, I'll say, there's a couple of different options. Usually I'll start with changing her nutrition. I'm usually not going to get her to fast any kind, like if we already have lab work and I see that there's an elevated RT3, we're usually not going to do much fasting. Like it's going to be like a 12-12. If that, it's like something that's nice and easy. It's not a big hormetic stressor on the body. And we're usually going to start with her nutrition. So I usually have 2 approaches that are like polar opposites of each other when it comes to thyroid, and they both work marvelously well. There's a bit of an art in terms of figuring out who is going to do better with what, but it's either full on carnivore, where we are, and this is usually the woman that has like thyroid antibodies. She has like a whole set of like deranged digestive issues, leaky gut. She has maybe some parasites, H. pylori. Like there's a whole sort of clinical picture that I'm kind of looking for. But I'm either putting her on a therapeutic, so short-lived carnivore diet, or I'm going to follow more of the Terry Wahls protocol, which is like, the polar opposite of carnivore, which is like 9 colors, all the colors of all the vegetables, an appropriate amount of protein and fat. But there are different sort of constituents in terms of which clinical, we'll say manipulation I'm going to follow. Okay. So with that, this is one of my favorite pictures. All these ladies in I would call this maybe the 40s or 50s. I love these bathing suits. I hope that over the last 2 weeks, I've been able to demonstrably show you that women have a much more complex hormonal environment, that we are much more sensitive to changes, let's say, in our environment, in our exogenous consumption, like, our response to foods, when we're fasting. We have, more moving parts and fluctuations that are, supposed to occur cyclically that don't necessarily happen in our male counterparts. And of course, we talked about this last week, that there's certainly a bias with studying men, right? So there isn't, it's getting better, but our culture's love and unfortunately sometimes obsession with randomized controlled trials and trying to tease out all the variables, I think has led to a real hole in the literature surrounding females. I'll say that it is getting better. We are starting to see more and more research that is just female focused, because we are starting to wake up to this idea that we are not little men. For women with PCOS, they responded just beautifully to fasting, kind of all kinds, until we sort of get that metabolic train, until she's, we start to see her healing. For women with estrogen dominance, really, really like a sort of a gut and liver evaluation, sort of that caloric liquid fasting, particularly in the luteal phase of her cycle. For my women who are chronically stressed and inflamed, we don't want to be adding more stressors. So again, like a nice, gentle fast for her. Same goes for thyroid. Women with low functioning thyroid, the fasting is not the place to start. It's usually the last place that we tweak if all the other variables that we've manipulated have not been working. And like I said, with my thyroid patients, it's going to be food that we start with. So I hope that you have found this really useful. And I'm just going to stop my share here and come back. There we go. Hello. So I hope that you found this useful. I would love to hear your feedback, your comments. We try to read, we do read every single review that comes in worldwide, whether that's coming in from the US, Canada, Europe, Oceania, all the places we read them. So would love to hear your feedback. Next week, I've been working on preparing an AMA. So I had posed some questions out to my Instagram followers, got a ton of questions. And so I am currently preparing to have a little nerd sermon with you on that. So that should be coming next week. And until then, I hope you have a great one, and I hope that you've gained a little bit more insight into why we always want to be very gentle with our fasting protocols as it pertains to ladies. With that, I bid you adieu, and we'll see you next week.